If somebody told you that you could help the climate and all you had to do was eat less beef, would you do it? Well, the Lancet Medical Journal found that reducing red meat intake is one of the most effective ways to curb emissions. And they say that it also helps reduce the rapidly increasing heat-related death rate. Joining us now from London to help us understand what exactly all of this means is Bloomberg climate change reporter Jess Shankelman. Jess, thanks so much for being here. The study has some pretty staggering statistics. The researchers found that heat-related deaths in older people rose 54% in the last 20 years. So connect the dots for us between red meat consumption and increasing temperatures, and as a result, heat-related deaths and the increase that we've seen.
Of course, this is a really wide-ranging study. It comes out every year for the last 5 years from the Lancet, which, as you say, is a medical journal. And they look at 40 different indicators. And the idea behind it is to try to draw the links between climate change and health, because climate change has such wide-ranging impacts on everything from, the economy, industry, but this one is specifically focusing on health. So as you say, they found that in the last 20 years, heat-related deaths have risen in older people by 54%, and there's a record 2.9 billion additional days of heatwave exposure affecting people over 65. That was last year. So that's kind of looking at the impacts of climate change. And one of the really important things that they find there is that healthcare systems are just not ready to deal with the impacts of climate change. Very similar to what we've seen with the pandemic this year. Now, when they come to the section on meat, it's a kind of idea that's been emerging over the last year or so of drawing the link between consumption and emissions. So the reason that eating red meat increases emissions is twofold. One is the methane that is emitted from cows. Many people know about that. That's a problem that's being tried to tackle. But the other issue is land clearance. So in order to have cattle on your land, say in the Amazon basin, you need to clear an area of rainforest, the size of a football pitch. And the more that happens, the more you're not having trees sequestering the carbon. So that's kind of being released into the atmosphere instead. So there's two reasons there.
So given your reporting, well, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is where the link is. So what the authors say is, when you look at emissions in any sector, you should look at who's producing them and who's consuming them. And they call that different scopes. So scope 1 is the emissions you're producing, and scope 2, scope 3 are the kind of emissions in your supply chain. So it's not just the cows in Brazil that are pumping out methane. It's also people potentially in places like China or Korea who are eating more and more beef as those nations become wealthier. And they're saying they're responsible too. And the impact of that is not just emissions, but also on their health, because the more you eat beef, the more likely you are to suffer heart attacks or have cancer.
Right, so the health effects are not just from rising temperatures, but also from actually eating the meat.
It's a double whammy.
Yeah, Jess, I do wonder if the ship has sailed, though, if this trend is reversible at this point. Is it too late to make these changes?
It's a really interesting question. So in the West, we've had a much higher red meat consumption for a long time. And what we're starting to see now is a trend towards people, particularly younger generations, moving towards plant-based diets. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, even the idea of veganism was very niche. It was something that only hippies did, people who were very, very committed to animal welfare. Now it's really become very fashionable. Companies like Unilever are trying to cash in on this, making more plant-based products. I'm sure there'll be lots of people having plant-based Christmases this year, even for their Christmas dinner. So what they found was that is having an effect in Europe, where people are turning to more vegetarian veganism, but still deaths from excess meat consumption in Europe is still very high. The question is, I think, what's going to happen in developing economies in the Western Pacific region, like I talked about earlier, like China, Korea, where people associate eating meat with wealth. I think in Europe almost that trend's being reversed, where the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to eat a very expensive salad.
Yeah, and because even the plant-based replacement products, at least available here in the United States, like Impossible and Beyond Meat, are oftentimes more expensive than actually buying the red meat. I do wonder too, just about the idea of this being all or nothing, based on your reporting and on this most recent article in the Lancet. Are scientists and researchers saying you have to completely cut out red meat, or are they just saying to eat less of it?
Right. So they do talk about excess red meat consumption. I think, the less meat that anyone eats, the more of an impact that's going to have on the climate. If you think about it in terms of a power plant, if your power plant is powered 100% coal, that's going to have a really bad impact on the climate. That's going to increase emissions. And if you switch to 50% biomass, that's going to have a less impact. If you use a wind farm instead, you're going to have no impact on the planet. So it's a similar way of thinking about it with meat. The less meat you eat, the more, the better the impact's going to be on the climate. But, then you do start to think about some of these plant-based substitutes. It's quite interesting to think about, for example, the production of almond milk requires a lot of water. So there's always going to be trade-offs that people have to think about, but there's a very clear finding. I think it's been established for quite a long time that consumption of red meat is a major contribution to emissions. One of the major questions, though, is it something that governments can legislate? Because while they can say, oh, our power grid is going to become 100% renewable by 2035, you can't really tell people to stop eating meat. That's a personal choice, and I think there's a lot of countries where people would see that as an infringement on their rights.
Yeah, I mean, given that in the United States we can't even agree to wear masks, good luck with that. Bloomberg's
Exactly.
Jess Shankelman in London. Thanks so much for your time today.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.